Okay, welcome everyone to today's ISESA webinar titled Are Scientific Cultures Benefiting Scientific Progress by Dr. Joe Warne. You're welcome, Joe.
Thanks so much for having me.
Joe is a sports science lecturer at Technological University Dublin and the director of the Sports Science Replication Centre. I came across a quote online that described Joe as a scientist known for his critical and unapologetic approach to research quality and validity, which I think is a great teaser for today's session. Having heard Joe passionately discuss his work, I've always walked away with a golden nugget of information of how I can be a better scientist. So I'm really looking forward to today's webinar, and I hope each of you can also leave with one, but maybe several golden nuggets today. Before I hand over to Joe, just a quick reminder to our audience, if you have any questions, can you just please pop them into the Q&A area and we'll follow them up at the end. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks very much, Colin, and thanks again for having me. I always find that the organizations like this and these types of forums are really the perfect place to talk about some of these issues that we're talking about here, because the idea is, and one of the mission statements for ISESA is to be able to communicate about research practices and standards. So thank you very much, guys, for having me. Let me share my screen and see if everything works okay. Will you just confirm you can see that there, Carla, for me? Is that okay?
Yes, that looks great, Joe.
Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us today. As already mentioned, I want to give you more of a meta-science look at research cultures and research practice. This is becoming a growing conversation, not just in the sports and exercise sciences, but across all aspects of science. And indeed, we're starting to see more and more conversations which allow us now to reflect on our own field and learn from those of others. And this is really a matter of perspective. And I want to first, let's phrase it in this context. I want you to imagine that there's a researcher who's sitting on a train and he wants to measure displacement of a ball. And so he's conducting an experiment right in front of his face. And so he drops this ball from 6 centimeters above his head. It bounces off the table, and he can use some simple physical principles to establish the displacement of this ball. However, you might also be interested in the displacement of this ball when you're standing outside of the train. And this train is now traveling at 80 kilometers an hour. The ball is doing exactly the same thing in front of this researcher sitting on that train, but your perspective is now very different. And the trajectory, the displacement of that ball is now very different than what you perceived whilst you were sitting directly in front of it. We could take the same idea and shift our perspective to now you look at the same ball, but you do so from the sun. You look back at the Earth. And at this point, the ball's displacement is traveling somewhere around 100,000 kilometers per hour. And the message here is really important, is that we often take our time to look at problems individually in a very isolated perspective. And in this case, the ball trajectory, the movement of this ball, the behavior of the ball is not changing, but our perspective of this very simple problem is. And this is meta-science. Meta-science is involved really in taking a step back and looking at the bigger perspective, the bigger picture, and the trajectory of science as a whole. And whilst many of us as researchers, we are the first example, the researcher with the ball working on our own individual problems. And it's really worth encouraging and reflecting on this idea that together we need to all take a step back and consider the bigger picture. What is the trajectory of our research, and how do we engage in these research cultures? So if we shift this perspective to a meta-science one, it is really understanding the science of science to examine not only the researchers and their behavior, but also how we undertake peer review, how journals encourage and engage in the validity and appropriate representation of our work, because this is the forum that we use to publish it. And so the perspective very much shifts to this bigger picture. And so to do so, we need to first have a very good idea of what is science? And whilst, the scientific method is very, very old, it's dated as far back as Aristotle, but more recently, 1600s, there was a text, the Novum Organum by Francis Bacon. And right then, he recognized that a critical part of this scientific principle is that scientists should not be motivated by fun, feelings of superiority, fame, power, or money. Instead, we should be conducting science to make the world a better place. So in other words, science should be a series of experiments whereby we grow and increase our level of understanding around the world as we know it. In our case, around the area of sports or exercise science. More recently, 2016, rigorous science is a theoretical or experimental approach is undertaken in a way that enhances confidence in the veracity of findings. So the scientific method is a well-established and very old principle around the way that we use this deductive reasoning on the basis of observations of data to make claims that we assume are true on the basis of building on science step at a time. So let's take this meta-science lens. We should argue that scientists should want to do science to make the world a better place. And therefore, the incentive of researchers, of governing bodies, of journals, of reviewers, should be in the pursuit of truth, to develop our understanding and knowledge of the known universe. This is the central calling of research. And part of the scientific method is we have a number of layers or lines of defense that will protect us in the case of objectivity in the way that we go about making these claims. These include three predominant levels here. We'll keep it simple for today. That is the level of the researcher. Researchers should be engaged in behaviors and training that will maximize the likelihood that the claims that are made in research are robust and reliable. The second is the journals themselves, and they have a high level of responsibility for maintaining integrity in the work that is reviewed and published as part of this scientific forum for sharing information. And the third is the peer reviewer. This is really our front line of defense. The entire method of publication involves a peer review process, which we all rely on a daily basis, all those that are actively engaged in research. And of course, the purpose of this last line of defense is to have other experts, peers in that area to appropriately examine your work to determine whether the methods are robust enough and that the claims are made in a manner that is appropriate to be shared amongst other people. We have to, though, ask ourselves the question that is all of these single steps that are protecting the truth free from bias? Because as a meta-scientist, we're particularly interested in bias and human behavior because we want to know whether we can enhance confidence in these findings. So we have to seriously look at each level as objective scientists to say, are we well controlling each of these individual factors? The issue is that we're increasingly concerned around the number of opportunities for bias to now start to perverse this course of truth. At the level of the researcher, in particular, we know that there are now biases around academic rewards. And there are a number of other things here, including training and personal gain. But there is a publish or perish culture. Researchers are engaged in behaviors that try to maximize publication output and minimize the time and effort in order to produce more and more work. The numbers count, the citation count, the number of publications. This appears to be the current currency in the research area. At the level of journals, whilst they are centrally involved and have the responsibility of regulating the research quality, we know that there are also opportunities for bias, in particular impact factor or academic rank. And these journals engage in a heavy level of competition to increase the number of clicks and likes and reads of their work in order to progress them higher and higher up this academic rank, because it is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And therefore, higher rank means higher profile, means higher earnings from the basis of these publishers. And at the level of the peer review, we are also limited not only in invested interest and questionable interpretation of pieces of work, in which we've all been subjective to in part of that peer review process, but more importantly, we might argue that the level of academic training at the level of peer review is also something that we have of concern. In particular, in the level of the peer review, this last line of defense, it appears that the major qualification, or the only qualification really that you need to have to become a peer reviewer to establish the last line of defense in the validity of this research, is that you must have at some point published something else. And in some cases, this isn't even true. In cases where peer reviewers reject the peer review of a paper, they can suggest other members of staff or other people that they might work with to peer review work. And there are cases where people that haven't even published work now become the peer reviewers. So the level of academic training, or rather I should say the level of qualification to be a peer reviewer, appears to be a very low bar. This was really highlighted in a landmark study by John Ioannidis, in which he claimed that most published research findings are probably false. And this led to a high level of scrutiny around this central process of how we are defending our research integrity, and largely led to a number of other fields, and then into our own, starting to deduce that maybe there is cracks in this defective system. And so the system or the cultures in which we now exist, which should be centrally directed towards this pursuit of this purest aspect of research for the pursuit of truth, appears to be instead more like this. We are now engaging in a rat race. And this is true of all areas of life, not just academia or in the research cultures. But we know that as we all scramble over ourselves to get to the top of this career ladder, whether it be publication numbers, our ranking, career aspirations, financial incentive, journal ranking, whatever it may be, we forget to realize that as part of this, we must remember that it's not just about these currencies, that these ranking systems that we all seem to operate within. And it ultimately appears that the greatest casualty in this process is the truth. Now, it's easy for me to say that, and so the remainder of this talk will be me presenting some of our evidence and the work of our colleagues to suggest that we do have some concerns around the quality of this process, and indeed that truth appears to be one of the great casualties in this process. And we can't do so without first reviewing the scientific method. Hopefully everybody here is in some way scientifically trained, should be aware of this hyper-deductive model of scientific reasoning. In other words, on the basis of collecting data, we formulate first a hypothesis or a theory that we'd like to test, and this should be falsifiable. We should be able to generate sufficient data to test the validity of this theory. And since the outcome is not known, we will then make a claim on the basis of this data supporting or not supporting our hypothesis, and make an assumption, if this has been done correctly, that we have control for error in the estimation or the claim that we're making. This method is well established, and I don't feel the need to go through each step of a scientific method. But I would say that when we now incorporate in this model these risks, these concerns from a meta-science perspective around bias, that we're not publishing for knowledge or truth, and it appears to be that we are confounding this scientific method for this publish or perish pathway that we're talking about. It appears that at every single stage of the scientific method, we now have major concerns around the integrity of how we're conducting research. And I want to present some of these concerns that we have here. And let's start with increasing fraud. And now I wouldn't suggest that fraud is by any means the majority of the reasons why we have concerns around research behaviors or cultures in our discipline. It definitely represents a minority of individuals involved, but humans are humans. And just as in sport, if there is an opportunity to cheat and take performance-enhancing drugs, it appears that some people will do so. In research, if there's an opportunity to maximize your outputs, people will do so. And so there is increasing evidence that, in particular, as we increase the number of scientists that are submitting work to be published, the number of cases of fraud are going up. Some notable examples include Elizabeth Bick, as shown here. She's now identified herself, just individually, over 4,000 potential cases of improper research conduct. In particular, she's interested in image identification. And then as you can see in this case, what she does is she tries to identify simple acts of copy and pasting, where people don't have all of the data for whatever type of photographic imagery or analysis that they're doing. And therefore, there is either accidental or deliberate copy and paste examples of people manipulating their imagery. And this, in this case, this is recognized as fraud, and these papers are retracted. But there's much more evidence than this. In surveys asking about behavior of colleagues, admission rates were 14% for falsification and up to 72% for other questionable research practices. It appears that a lot of people know that their colleagues and peers are engaged in questionable practices around the way that they're conducting research. And again, as usual, we see that there is a lower level of claims being made at the level of the person and more about colleagues or individuals in which we are working with. And it's no accident that in 2023, we had a new record where more than 10,000 research papers were retracted. And this is not just based on principles of fraud, but around a number of different issues and concerns with increased ability to now evaluate research, and particularly with the invention of artificial intelligence. We are getting much better tools from a meta-science perspective to evaluate how credible this research is. So that's one reason why this number would have gone up, but it also would indicate that we are engaged increasingly in questionable research behaviors to maximize these publication potentials. One of these is, of course, publication bias, and this is defined as studies where being published on the basis that they have significant or novel or positive findings. And we know overwhelmingly that this is true, that studies that find something novel or interesting are way, way more likely to be published. And so this would engage researchers in questionable behaviors where they would try to maximize the positive findings in their studies. And if we look at some evidence for this, we know that one of the big things that people are very interested in pushing is, of course, these impact factors. So we talked about this journal ranking problem that we have. So if journals are interested in developing or increasing this journal ranking, whether it's H-index, impact factor, Simajo index, there are a number of different ways that we quantify this. But the ultimate idea or the goal or the race is to be the top of these ranking systems. This doesn't just exist, as you see on the left-hand side here, for journals, but also for individual researchers. We also have our own ranking, our own index. And you might ask whether this system of ranking ourselves against one another is appropriate in a research ecosystem, where instead we should be examining the validity of claims that people are making, not on the output of how many things that they have produced. If we look at a couple of research papers, we know that novel research suggests they're significantly more likely to be published. So if you want to increase these ranking scores, both as a journal, but also as an individual, you should try to conduct research where you find novel findings. Also, citations are commonly used as an index of this metric, both for personal indexes, but also for journals. But the impact factor or the citation rate was actually never meant to be a measure of research quality. There is in fact no evidence that citation numbers, particularly with respect to the ranking of journals, has any reflection of dimensions of research quality. In fact, when we look at the original journal impact factor creation, it was calculated by Thomson Reuters, originally created, it's now calculated in this example by Thomson Reuters. They created this as a tool to help librarians identify which journals to purchase. In other words, how many people are reading your papers? How many people are reading your journals? And if people want to read these ones, we're going to stock more of them in our libraries. Instead, now this seems to be synonymous with quality. People perceive that impact factor indicates a higher level of quality, and we do not have any evidence for this. The computer score of journal impact factor is not being recognized as a representation of journal quality in a number of studies. In fact, non-replicable publications are cited more than replicable ones. So false findings that are more novel or sexy or interesting are less likely to be reproduced, but more likely to be cited. We are humans that are influenced by clickbait as much as anybody else. And so the more sexy you can make your publications, the more likely they are to be cited. You can see in that example alone how citation number impact factor is not an appropriate measure of research quality. The issue, of course, here is that if you are incentivized to maximize the novelty or the significance of your research, knowing correctly that it will increase the likelihood of a journal accepting it and it being published, you might engage in a number of behaviors called p-hacking strategies. And we could spend 2 hours talking about this slide alone, so I'm just going to use a number of these as examples of this. P-hacking essentially is the opportunities that people use to slightly manipulate, either consciously or subconsciously. I want to make it clear here that I'm never deliberately accusing people of falsifying their work. I think there's an important distinction here. But instead, we can selectively or very creatively manipulate or change our decisions in the way that we conduct our research to maximize the likelihood that we will see significant findings. Now, fortunately, meta scientists have a very useful tool to evaluate this, and this is called a p-distribution. So if we take a whole load of published literature in any field or any literature body, and we plot just a normal histogram, a probability curve of the published p-values, we can examine whether there appear to be any evidence of p-hacking strategies or indeed a significance bias or publication bias. So let me explain so we're all on the same page here. In this hypothetical example of a p-distribution, it's just a normal histogram for those that are aware of histograms. This is an example where we test a null effect. So on the left-hand side here, you can see a graph where we've taken 1,000 studies, and in the true effect in this hypothetical example is that there is a null finding. There is no difference in any of these studies. And if you were to plot the distribution of these p-values as a histogram, you would see that 95% of the time you would sample from this distribution, you would claim correctly that there is no effect, that a p-value is not less than 0.05, indicated by this red line here. However, since we very commonly set a type 1 error rate or a level of alpha at 5% or 0.05, you're also recognizing that about 5% of the time that you sample from this null distribution, you're going to accidentally claim that there is a finding, a type 1 error rate. So this should occur if things are done appropriately and correctly, no more than 5% in all observable or published literature. And if we zoom in just in from 0.05 in this second plot here on the right-hand side, you will see that it is a monotone or even distribution. There's no change in the distribution of the frequency of these p-values. Let's take another hypothetical example, but this time where we have a true effect, but with low statistical power. And we'll talk about statistical power being one of our concerns around research in the sports and exercise sciences. But in this example from the work of Aaron Caldwell, you'll see that if there is a real effect to observe, again, this red line indicating statistical significance at 0.05, with a small sample size, a low statistical power, we would only correctly identify a real effect about 35% of the time in this example. In other words, our statistical power is 35%. Now, this is interesting alone because in the published literature in the sports and exercise science, we have an inflated rate of positive findings in the literature of around 80 to 90% of all reported literature. And that would only be true if, one, we were always doing studies that had a real significant large effect to be observed, or that we had a very high, and we had a very high statistical power to detect these effects most of the time. However, if, as in the case in the sports sciences, we have a very low sample size and therefore statistical power prevalent across the entire discipline, it would be very questionable if indeed we saw a very high amount of published significant findings, since we would not have the power to detect them. So this is why just plotting or understanding p-distributions in itself can be very educational. If we did have a high statistical power, it would look like this. If there was a real effect to be observed, and you had a very high sample size, in this case 160 samples, you would see that almost all of your findings would correctly claim that you had a statistically significant effect. Remember, in this hypothetical example, there is an effect to be found. In fact, when you keep increasing your sample size again and again and make this much higher, you will start making an effect in the wrong direction. And this is called a Lindsay's paradox, in that you will incorrectly claim that there are effects when there in fact is not an effect in that group. And that's why if you just continue sampling indefinitely, you reach sample sizes in the thousands, you will always find statistically significant differences, because even the most small, insignificant effects are found to be statistically significant. So we do have to be careful here about not always selecting an alpha at 0.05 as our baseline for how we make claims in our literature. But what would happen if there was bias involved in this process? Well, if we were to plot a distribution of published p-values, we might see something like this, a questionable change. Remember that I've shown you that it should be approximately normal or even distribution here. Just inside this line at 0.05, suddenly we see a huge amount of p-values in published literature. Now, this could only be explained by a high degree of p-hacking, people deliberately manipulating their data to find effects because they know this is going to be published, or that journals are only publishing significant novel findings, and therefore this is an effect related to significance or publication bias. So what if we did this in the sports science? So here I want to present our first piece of evidence. This is from the Sports Science Replication Center. We spent 4 months evaluating and coding 350 studies published across 10 sports and exercise science journals. We plotted all of the main effects or the main findings that they wanted to report in that study. We recorded the p-values, and I show it here on a histogram. Just have a look at this questionable distribution of p-values in the sports and exercise science literature. Not only do we have this very sudden increase in p-values just inside this threshold of 0.05, which is not possible on the basis of a normal distribution of p-values. It's also not possible because the typical sample size of our literature is very small. But also have a look at the absence of any p-values just outside 0.05. This here alone is indication of p-hacking in our literature body. Our researchers are actively engaged in behaviors that if they find something that just quite isn't significant and they say, oh, this isn't going to be published, they engage in behaviors that deliberately manipulate their data to bring it just inside this celebration line, we could call it, just inside that 0.05. So this in itself is very alarming. There's a more intuitive way that we can plot this. This is just literally a histogram of p-values reported in literature, and that's through a z-curve. And so I won't spend too long on this because essentially it's a very similar analysis. The only difference really is that we now take those p-values and we normalize them to a z-score. And that will allow us to plot a normal bell curve distribution of this data. The only difference here that we'll talk about now is just that these are flipped. So P-values greater than 1.96 for a Z-score indicate statistical significance. In the previous examples, I had the red line indicated in the other direction. And if there wasn't bias, if this was just a typical area, of course, we would find that there would be only about 5% of the time would we expect to find an effect if it didn't exist, if the true effect was that it was a null finding. So this area here represents non-significant findings, and about 5% of them are significant in the basis of null effects. This is what it would look like in a more rounded set of data, for example, where we have findings that are true and false. But again, the main thing I want us to focus on here is that this is a normal bell curve distribution and is not influenced by this level of significance. So we conducted a case study in the Journal of Sports Science with just over 100 studies, and we ran a Z-curve, and this is what it looked like. Again, you can see that we do not have a normal bell curve distribution around this Z-score distribution. Again, values that are just outside of statistical significance appear suddenly by some questionable method to disappear. And just inside statistically significant, we see a huge increase in the proportion of the distribution of published statistically significant values. This is highly questionable information and recognizes without doubt that either at the level of a journal or at the level of the researcher, we have bias that is interfering with the pursuit of truth in our scientific literature. We're not the only ones to look at this. This was a much larger study in Journal of Science and Medicine in Sport by David Borg and colleagues. They sampled almost 4,900 research articles, and this time they're looking at odds ratios. So the distribution looks a little bit different. But for odds ratios, essentially the greater the value is away from 1, that means that the higher effect that you will see in an odds ratio. And they did some machine learning and some mining algorithms to sample a lot of information. And they looked at odds, hazard, and risk ratios. And again, they saw very similar to us, this very questionable distribution where odds or hazards that showed null effects were very, very likely to be represented in the literature. And the significant odds ratios, greater than 1.96 on either side, either for a higher odds risk or a lower odds risk, were much, much more prevalent in the scientific literature. This, again, represents a complete absence of objective, clear, and evidence that reflects both true and false findings, and this is a high reason for concern. So again, if we were to ask how would researchers engage in behaviors to maximize their publication percentage on the basis of this rat race, one of them might be in the way that they explore their hypothesis tests. And we should define here that there are two ways that we can conduct, there are many ways that we conduct research, but let's keep this simple and say that we are either conducting exploratory research, where we want to sample a huge amount of research and to make observations around potential correlations, associations, differences that we might observe in larger studies. So we sample 10, 20, 30 dependent variables, and from the conclusions of this study, we say we've identified in this that 2 or 3 of these happen to show something maybe. And on that basis, we now need confirmatory research. This is our hypothesis-based or theoretical research that takes single isolated study effects or dependent variables that runs a very carefully controlled study, controlling for confounding, and then make claims on the basis of a single study and a single variable in isolation. So hypothesis-driven research should be on the right-hand side. And we teach this in research methods. We teach that less is more. When we are telling students how to write a hypothesis, we use very simple examples, like here's one dependent variable, you're manipulating it in 2 different conditions, you design your study just to test this one variable. One of the issues appears to be in sports and exercise science, and we've just recently hired a master's student to look at this full-time, is that people are appearing to manipulate this hypothesis process and what I might define as exploitative research. So they don't distinguish the difference between exploratory and confirmatory research. Instead, they collect data on a huge amount of variables, and then after the fact, after they've observed all of this data, they now write up a manuscript to say, oh, by the way, this is the one that we were actually interested in, and this is the one that showed the effect of interest. Isn't that a coincidence? So it appears that we're mixing both explorative research and confirmatory, and that's not appropriate. And this leads to a number of different opportunities, such as harking, developing a hypothesis after you've already seen your results. And p-hacking we've talked about here. Cherry picking is the act of looking through a large amount of data, choosing selectively which ones you want to write up in your manuscript, and then presenting that because now you can show significant, novel, interesting findings, and journals are more likely to publish it as a result. And the issue here is that we leave a very large space for questionable decision making on the behalf of the researcher. And I mentioned that even at undergraduate level, when we're teaching about this linear or less is more process, we teach that a hypothesis should use a defined PCOT method, population intervention control outcome and time or study design. We should specify a very clear and objective independent and single dependent variable with an expected effect and direction of that effect. We then would design a study with only one dependent variable, which has one statistical test, and then we can very clearly make an appropriate exception or rejection of the theory on the basis of the data that we've collected in this study. We recently came up with a metric to try and evaluate this, which we called the hypothesis ratio method. And so we can have, in this example, we have a hypothesis to variable ratio of 1 to 1. We have one hypothesis and one dependent variable. And we have one hypothesis and one statistical test, one t-test in this example to examine this difference. And this is how we suggest that research should be conducted when we're doing confirmatory work. The reality is far different. And we're currently sampling 300 plus studies to try and evaluate this issue. And here's one example where in the hypothesis, the authors use what we call an umbrella term. So instead of specifically defining what the dependent variable of interest is, they use an umbrella term like we're going to examine many things around the sprint acceleration force velocity profile. And this is just an example of actually some of them. This isn't even all of the ones they included in this study. But what you can see is that within that, they now test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different dependent variables. Each of these variables are tested in a number of different ways. They have main effects in a two-way ANOVA, they have the interaction, they have then the post hoc follow-up. And from this, what you might see is the hyper to variable ratio is 1 to 9, but the hyper to statistical ratio is 1 to 54. Authors can then cherry pick which of these tests support their underlying theory without previously registering their intent to do so, and then use this objective bias to then say this finding corroborates our hypothesis. When you have a lot of information, you can very easily find a way to craft a response or an argument that it supports the data that you're showing. So our early work on this is showing that on average, in the hypothesis statement, when people define in a confirmatory study, they state 2 dependent variables in their hypothesis, but they test 20. And they result in an average of 88 p-values per study that we've examined. And you can imagine just how wide this leaves this hypothesis space and this questionable reporting of the way that we interpret our findings. That's why we have an inflated false positive error rate, a type 1 error rate, I should say, because people are allowed to flexibly report on any number of different aspects or angles in their work. This 88 might be alarming, but we're regularly coding studies in the thousands. We have studies where we have more than 1,500 p-values in a single study alone, and yet they still come to one binary hypothesis conclusion at the end of that study. So we really need to change the way that we define and use our hypothesis. I mentioned a while ago that we use the Z-curve distribution, and one of the values of doing so is that it allows us to try to expect or anticipate whether or not we have adequate statistical power to make the claims that we're making. Already in Journal of Sports Sciences, Abt and colleagues identified that the median sample size was 19 in that journal, and that is far less than we would require to really make meaningful claims in our literature. In our Journal of Sports Science case study, we observed an average estimated statistical power across significant and non-significant findings around 53%. So that means that you're only going to be able to ever make a claim on a statistically significant result, accurately make the right claim about 50% of the time. And we also can have an expected replication rate, which will tell us on the basis of those that we do claim are a statistically significant effect, how many of them do we think are likely to replicate, assuming that all similar conditions, sample size, statistical power apply. And it's about 61%. So about 39% of the time when we make a claim that we found a statistically significant effect, we believe that these would not be true, that we would not accurately have made the right decision. I mentioned that this was a case study, and we also did this in a much larger sample of 350 studies across 10 sports and exercise science journals. Then it got even more alarming. We saw that the average power across these 350 studies across 10 flagship journals was just 11%, and that the replication rate, or the replication failure, I should say, rose to 50%. Now, this is a real high level of concern that we have around the way that we design our studies and the claims that we're making on the basis of published literature. These sample size concerns are important for a number of reasons. Because of publication bias, we know that studies that have larger effect sizes are more likely to be published. Because if you have a larger effect size, that's very likely to lead to a statistically significant effect, and that is more likely, therefore, to result in an effect or a publication in this case. And this is called winner's curse. Because if you happen to find an effect, you celebrate, it gets published, but it's very unlikely that this is actually a real or reasonable effect to be claiming on the basis of that literature unless you've really carefully planned for it. And that basically means that effect sizes are heavily biased towards upwards, and we overinflate the effect sizes in our literature. And so this is some of our work from our replication project. All of the ones highlighted here indicate when we actually directly replicate these studies, the black line is the original claim from these original manuscripts, and the blue dot here represents the regression of the effect size when we at the very least double the sample size and reconduct the study. You can see that in the vast majority of cases, we see significant regression of the real effect size. This is important because one of the things that we ask people to do is to justify their sample sizes on the basis of a power analysis. And we do a power analysis by relying on previous published literature to say this is the effect size that they observed. Therefore, this is how we're going to power our study. So the solution is, well, maybe you should use a sample size calculation. And these effect sizes matter because we can use them to interpret practical significance of the results. It matters in addition to p-values because it informs how large an effect is or meaningful. We also use them in meta-analysis, of course, to summarize or meta-synthesize a number of different effects together. And as I've just mentioned, we use it to inform power analysis. But what happens if all of these effects are upwardsly biased and we suffer from this winner's curse? Well, it means that we have inflated claims. We have a biased meta-analysis which doesn't represent the actual truth or the real effects in existence, and it leads to small sample sizes. So I want to elaborate on that last point here. If I took a real case study where I wanted to actually really inform my sample size calculation, and I'm using caffeine because it's a fun example that I use all the time. Here's a couple of meta-analysis on caffeine, which, and the literature consistently shows for caffeine that the effects of caffeine are trivial to small. If you drink a cup of coffee, it doesn't turn you into Robocop. So it's a very subtle stimulant, an ergogenic aid, which might have very small effects on human performance. And the literature consistently shows this. The problem is, of course, that if you were to use this basis for your sample size analysis, the sample size for a crossover placebo-controlled trial in caffeine would be 216. And this immediately becomes very unfeasible. And hence one of the reasons why we have an issue with low statistical power in our published work. As a result, so this would be very difficult and unfeasible to do. And so you might say, well, let's actually, instead of actually looking at meta-analysis, let's go and choose a study that has also looked at something similar. But remember that I've said that an inflated effect size is very common in this literature. What that's going to do is reduce the sample size requirement in your study. This will happen again, and you will find a larger effect inflated by your lower sample. Someone will use your larger effect to inform their power analysis. They will have a smaller sample size as a result, and this will spiral into an example as you see here. They say, this is a caffeine study. They did a power analysis. They observed in a previous study that the effect size was 3.68, and therefore the projected sample size for a caffeine trial, remember I've just told you we should have 216 participants, is 3. So this is madness that we've arrived at this level of logic. In fact, what we believe is that people are not using power analysis in a meaningful way prior to conducting their research. Because on the basis of the second point you can see on the screen here, when we actually examine the difference in sample sizes between studies that reported a power analysis and those that didn't, we found no difference between them. And this makes us ask an important question. Are individuals retrofitting sample size calculations after the fact? Because it's convenient, it makes it look good, it's more likely to be published if they have a power analysis, but it is largely meaningless in this process. So we go back to this scientific method, and I could probably jokingly say, well, we could now probably call this the sports science method. There is all sorts of questionable practices happening in this process, which really lead us to have major concerns around the integrity of this scientific method. And so the bottom line is, how do we check for this? What is the single best way that we can evaluate the confidence or the truth in our literature? And the answer is replication. Replication is very simply conducting the same study again and again and again. And if your theory is in any way valid or consistent or repeatable, many people in different scenarios with different samples will be able to see the same thing. This is the gold standard in literature, something that should be largely celebrated. It represents this idea that science builds science, that together As a collaborative network of individuals pursuing the truth, we can build or falsify research by conducting replication to understand a field of literature. So what does the literature say about the level of replication? Since this is the cornerstone of science, here are 5 different examples ranging from human behavior and psychology to medical research, both medicine and cancer biology, indicating that the level of replication in these very large replication studies is alarmingly low. One in particular here was the Psychology Many Labs project, because this really initiated what we call the crisis of confidence in today's published literature. They observed that in 100 reputed and replicated studies that they could only replicate effects about 50% of the time. That means that 50% of our published literature is false. It is making false claims on the basis of all of these questionable practices in this culture that we now exist in. And of course, some of you may be aware that this is the main initiative of the Sports Science Replication Center. So you guys are lucky this is the first time we're publicly showing this. It's been at ACSM in a poster, but we have our results finalized. This has just been accepted in sports medicine. We saw the worst replication rate of any field that has explored this so far. In fact, we claim that only 28% of our published literature in the sports and exercise sciences is replicable. Now, this is more than alarming. This recognizes that way less than half of our literature is showing real, true effects on the basis of all of these questionable practices that I have just provided evidence on. Not only did we see a very low and alarming replication rate, and this wasn't just based on p-values being consistent, this was also based on a regression of effect size estimates. We saw that the effect size regressed in our discipline about 75%. So I talked about inflated effect size estimates. We're inflating them about 75% higher than the real effects. And this tells us that the average across all scientific disciplines that have actually done large replication studies is less than 50%. What does this tell us? It says that if you are a researcher, from now on, don't bother collecting data. Don't write a hypothesis. Don't try and get funding. If you have something you'd like to test and you're sitting at home with a cup of coffee and you think, oh, that would be interesting. I wonder what the effect would be there. Just flip a coin. You will be right more often than if you undertake the full process of going through that scientific method. I mean, it's absolutely hilarious that I can make that statement. I can be confident it's true. You should just flip a coin. And so it's funny until it isn't funny. What if this is cancer research in children? What if it's something that's going to change our prevalence of type 2 diabetes, or the transformative nature of sport that might change one person's life, or if a whole nation is successful, to uplift a whole nation and change our economic status? What if this is something around this impending catastrophe that is climate change? Our research matters. And having a success rate or an accuracy rate or a hit rate of less than 50% is not acceptable in any area of the world, let alone in the scientific literature that is supposed to be this very credible, high-tier, very respected industry in the world. This is something that collectively we need to address. We need to work together to improve, because it is not acceptable. So this has been very negative, and I'm coming towards the end of my presentation here. I will say that there is some positive changes coming. There's been a number of positive structural community-based changes that have come as a result of people being increasingly concerned about some of these issues that we've talked about. Here's some examples. There's procedural change, structural changes, community changes. There is always hope. Even just last week, we launched in Ireland the first Irish reproducibility network, in line with what the UK reproducibility network is doing. There is increasing conversations and awareness around these issues. People are actively trying to become better researchers, and together we can. It's about collaboration and improving what we do. Some of the earliest things that you can do is shown in green here. And in particular, if you want to immediately improve the way that you conduct your research, you control for some of these things, I've highlighted them in green here. And I recognize that this talk has very much been a somewhat negative summary of the state of our literature, and hasn't really given you any practical means of improving what you do. And I have talked to the guys here at ISESA, and we have committed to doing a part 2 of this talk. So sometime after Christmas, we are going to do a part 2, which will be a much more practical primer, some simple ideas and tips and ways in which you can immediately improve on many of these different aspects to immediately make you a better researcher and better control these aspects. So before I finish, I'd just like to say thank you to these individuals. If you're impressed by any of the things I've talked about here, it is not my work. I am the dummy of this group. It very much is on the incredibly high level of intelligence and thought and work by the individuals that you see on the screen here. In particular, to all of our collaborators of the replication network, you can see in the map in the bottom right corner. And in particular, I just want to say congratulations to Dr. Jenny Murphy. She just passed her Viva last week with 0 corrections. She's an incredibly hardworking individual. We're very proud of her. So I thought it would be a nice point to mention at the end of this talk. So thank you for listening. I very much look forward to some questions. Hopefully we can all work together. Please reach out if you want to any help with any of these things. I'm more than happy to get involved.
That's great. Thank you very much, Joe. Excellent presentation. In some part depressing, but we have to regain trust, I think is a key message as well, trust in what we're doing. I have a question here that has come from one of our audience members, and that is it not difficult to replicate a study with the same cohort that was used in the original study? So how would you control for this?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's actually a number of different ways that you conduct replication. The most obvious way is what we call a direct or a close replication, which is you take the exact methods of a published study, but you don't use the same sample. You use a sample on a different sample from the same cohort. So remember that when someone writes their methodology section, they will set a number of delimitations or boundaries on their sampling procedures. We collected X number of people between the ages of 18 and 22 that were recreationally fit or elite volleyball players or whatever it is. So on the basis of replication, you would never take exactly the same sample. You would collect a new sample of data, but copy the same methods exactly, and then see whether you can find the same outcome as the original study. Now, of course, that has constraints with it because you'll never exactly match the same boundaries of that population. But that's an important thing to consider because a study that collects data and makes inferences about a population is never meant to be interpreted in isolation. And if a theory is true, it should be true across also other samples from the same population. And that's why that method of replication is very valuable. The second is something we call theoretical replication. So that is actually that you don't necessarily directly copy the exact methods of a study. And this is more commonly done kind of informally in research, where you might explore the boundaries of an effect. So let's talk about the caffeine one there. So you might have a number of studies that have looked at 3 milligrams per kg of caffeine, but other ones might look at 4 milligram or 2 milligram, or look at it over a 30-minute ingestion period or a 60-minute ingestion period. They're all examining the same theoretical aspect of the effect of caffeine as an ergogenic aid, but they're slightly modifying the boundary constraints to examine how far does this truth extend? Is it only true of 3 milligrams of caffeine? Does it also work at 4? Does it work at 2? Because that's the only way that we can establish the limits of knowledge, right? How long does this theory hold true until it doesn't hold true? So a theoretical replication is a much more broad, less well-defined process in that. It's what, okay, I think that answers the question, I think.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Joe. Um, I have a question. What role do academic institutions play in changing this, perhaps, or enhancing what you've just spoken about, or you might say supporting sustainable scientific practices?
I think it's a great question. I think traditionally, up until recently, they haven't done much to
Mm,
support this. I think in general, because universities, just as in journals, are very interested in research metrics.
mm,
Universities also have a world ranking system and this competitive aspect of what they're trying to do to recruit individuals in, and that largely, and still, like I see conversations even within my own group here in the university around people celebrating how many publications we've got. Aren't we great because we published 100 studies this year? So we still tend to fall into these traps of it's all about numbers. How much can you do? But I say that because I do think it's changing. I think increasingly we're seeing now university in particular are very interested in open access routes to make much more transparent processes and how they engage in research and require their researchers to do so. I think there's a much better support of open access support funds. For example, there's a European fund which will support the costs associated with publishing and open access. And there's also a shift. I can't speak of many other institutions, but for our one at least, there's a shift now towards monitoring impact of research as opposed
mm.
to the citation counts of research. So we have to do these kind of impact case assessments. So essentially, you have to provide evidence that your research is meaningfully contributing to policy change, to practice, to the stakeholders. There's actually resulting in meaningful information being transferred to these individuals. And this is a much better metric for research, right? Because the whole point we do it is to inform better practice for everybody else. So to answer your question, I think things are improving. I think they do have a lot of responsibility here. And that doesn't just go for the universities, but also I think for the grant bodies, the people who fund research. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done here in them making things like pre-registration mandatory. So for example, we take in Ireland the IRC funding pathway. It would be quite easy and feasible to say, on the basis that we give you this funding, you must demonstrate pre-registration in each of the reports that you're producing here, or any number of other requirements on the basis of that funding. I think universities could do the same thing, and I think that would be a positive move forward.
Okay, excellent. A question that's come in from our audience. Would you find that a lot of research proposals are rejected on the basis of being too simplistic? For example, only one independent and dependent variable. Harking seems to be standard practice.
Yes, a lot of these things are standard practice. And so it's very difficult to sit here and criticize very senior researchers and saying what you're doing is not appropriate, because it is a part of this culture that we exist in. I think this point is very important to make. It doesn't say that this culture is appropriate or correct, but we also have to survive within an ecosystem that requires us to play the game. And this is an important distinction, because if I take myself as an example here, I also work with undergraduate students and postgrad students who, on the basis of their career success, need publications, because we still live or die by a CV that will get you employed. One of those aspects is, do you have any publications? So it would be unfair of me to stick to my morals to such an extent that I told a student, no, you need 300 samples here for this, so it's going to take you 3 years to do so. So it's not feasible. I don't want you to do this work. Instead, it would be more fair for them, since I know that these practices are ongoing and it's accepted culture, to knowingly engage in these practices to maximize the success of my students in the future. This is a big problem. We need far better collaborative efforts in making it not so easy for these things to exist, because I think this point is important, that if someone did a very, very high level study with a 1-to-1 ratio, and this will never happen, or hopefully it will, but it's very rare, that the journals would say it's so robust that this is what we're looking for. And instead, because it's not as interesting, there's not as many variables tested, there's not as much scope to the work, very commonly you'll see exactly these comments that it's too simplistic, you haven't covered enough things, it doesn't have much impact in society, and therefore we're going to reject this because, on those bases. Now, this point is interesting because I recently had a talk with Franco Impellezzi, who is the editor-in-chief of Sports Science and Medicine in Football. And he's big on all of these things that we've talked about here. He's a really fantastic advocate of better research practices. And he pushed the journal to start now. All of his sub-editors are heavily trained and pushed towards, we do not care about citation count. We are not evaluating research on the basis of that we believe people will cite it. And they entirely changed their ecosystem and their research culture within that journal to evaluate quality only. Their impact factor went up more than most other journals that year. So they saw significant growth in their ranking on the basis of actually making better decisions on the basis of quality. So I think it is possible that people do this better, but they're hesitant to, because again, we still have to play this game.
Okay, a great question has come in. As a non-academic, are there any obvious red flags I can look for when I'm reading individual papers? Great question.
I've had this question a lot and I struggle to answer it, I'm afraid, all the time. It still requires some level of education within a lot of these different things. It's still very difficult to look at a paper and have any clear objective opinion about how well it's been designed. And the reason I say that, and sorry, it's not a good answer, is in the absence of pre-registration, and we know that less than 5 to 10% of all of our published literature is ever pre-registered, and nobody does registered reports. So that's something that we can definitely improve. It's impossible to evaluate the number of decisions that people made when they finally present this work. The final paper is a polished turd. Okay, it has gone through many iterations. There's been many sets of data. There's been many decisions made. We've cut this stuff out. We'll never show them this. They don't need to know that this happened. We don't need to know that this person injured themselves and they didn't make the start line, etc., etc. So when we have a final published manuscript, really what we're evaluating is at a very face level, what the authors decided to share with us. And what we'll never know is what's under that black box, what's in the under the hood. what went into the formulation of that manuscript for us to really know and evaluate with confidence the validity of what they're doing there. So for me, the most obvious red flags are, and this is still very rare, so it means that most studies fall into this category, right? Is if people don't openly share their data. So there should be an open sharing link or some sort of resource or supplementary material where all of the data attached to this paper is included. There's a link to a pre-registration, and there is a full and very exhaustive list of all of the statistical nuances and reports that we might require to fully understand what they've done. But that doesn't help a non-academic, so that's why I say it's not a very good answer, I'm afraid. There's just far too many layers to this onion. And I'm still learning as well, by the way. I thought I've been teaching research methods for 12 years. I thought when I started this initiative 5 years ago, I had a good grasp of it. Turns out I'm as clueless as anybody else. It's a layer and layer of issues that we see. So sorry, it's not a very good answer.
Sure, but nevertheless, thank you very much. Another question has come in. Any insight on how common sports science journals perceive exploratory work rather than confirmatory work? Any data to say that they are reluctant to agree to peer review compared to when the manuscript is framed as confirmatory?
I don't have any data specifically on that, but anecdotally, we can say that this is definitely true. Because exploratory work is devalued in a similar way that null findings are devalued and in a similar way that replication studies are devalued. They're, they're very important in the scientific process, but they're not very sexy. They don't show us the end result of what we want to see. And so the issue with exploratory work is it's undervalued and therefore underdone in that we need to first do these type of studies where we see, is there any possible effects in this theory? Let's do everything and see what we find and very carefully control for error rates. And if something happens to flag up, that is in no way evidence of an effect. That's when we now need to switch it to a confirmatory study, go and isolate this single thing and then go and test it. But again, your point is absolutely right that because this is seen as a less valuable or less citable aspect of work, it's definitely diminished as far as its likelihood to be published. And the issue actually now is that people are still doing exploratory work. I mean, I'm coding papers every day at the moment on this, but they don't define it as that. People are actually often confused between the difference between exploratory and confirmatory work. So people are putting in hypothesis statements that are testing a theory, and as I've already mentioned in some examples here, they're testing 20 or 30 variables. That's exploratory work. That's not a confirmatory study, because that kind of seems to bypass the need for the journal for it to be confirmatory and more interesting. So maybe again, people are slightly playing that game, or they're not quite sure of the distinction between the two.
Okay. Okay. Last question, just due to time constraints. How is it that so many papers are being published without detailed information in the methods section as to how the research was carried out?
Hey, great question. Your guess is as good as mine. No. So there are a number of things here. Like at the face level, we can evaluate the way in which someone has adequately reported the methodology of a study, and this is reasonably easy to peer review and to evaluate. The issue again is more so I have concerns with again what's done under the hood, and we call these degrees of freedom in the research space. So that because you can formulate this method in any number of different ways, there's no right or wrong answer, and really it then comes down to rather than how well they define the methods, how confident are they in the claims that they can make on the basis of these methods? So that requires us to have a very stringent statistical power analysis, to have a very well justified level of alpha in our study, to all be done prior to collecting the data, and we also should be testing very strict or stringent hypotheses, things that we generally don't know the answer to, such in a way that essentially when we design a study, if we were to make a claim at the end and someone else was to review it, we can say, wow, I fully believe that what you found is a real effect. There's no way for me to reject it because you have crossed every box and dotted every T to demonstrate that if you are making this claim, you are highly confident that you have made the successful claim. And that's the stuff that we appear to miss. We have good methodological detail in the methods section, but we have very poor power analysis statements. We have very poor justification of alpha and beta, and the statistical analysis is very convoluted. We often see people with reasonably low level of expertise in running data analysis or statistical analysis. And so it offers a lot of questionable ways to go about the methods in its final form.
Okay, great. Well, folks, the sad news is that our time's up, but the good news is that Joe is going to come back and do a follow-up session that maybe in terms of tips of how we boost our power, how we maybe do those sample size calculations, because I know with some of my colleagues, these are the type of questions that we challenge and explore. So I think that'll be really fascinating and very valuable, Joe. So thank you for offering a follow-up session.
No problem.
Just to let our audience know that our next webinar is on the 19th of December, so just before Christmas, with Dr. Angela Carlin discussing physical activity in children and adolescents. And just a reminder to also follow our webpage at www.isesa.ie, where you'll find a host of details of things that are going on, great blogs, and also to check on our social media channels for all of Bruce's fantastic podcasts that are coming out at the moment. So there's a wealth of information to keep you going. So thank you again, Joe, and thank you very much to the audience for tuning in and joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.